Reddit, what's your family's we could have been rich story? Relative of mine was once offered an opportunity to invest in a coffee shop chain. Back when they were about to expand into my country. When he saw the prices, he asked who is going to pay $10 for a cup of coffee. Turns out a lot of people like Starbucks. My grandfather helped with construction on Disney World. He was offered either stock or a lump sum. They didn't particularly need the money, but my grandmother wanted to order something expensive out of a catalog. So they took the cash. Thanks, Grandma. I don't know which of the hundreds of useless, never used knickknacks it was, but I'm sure it was well worth the millions your stock would have been worth today. Back in the late 90s early zeros, my dad thought that internet pornography was going to be a huge cash cow and wanted to quit his job to design what are basically the tube sites of today. My mom was like, we have 2 kids in elementary school, WTF. So he didn't do it. My family was descended from high-ranking government officials in the Qing dynasty. My great-grandparents owned multiple houses in the center of Beijing. There were chests filled with gold and jade in our houses. Then the Cultural Revolution hit and everything was taken away. Out of fear, my great-uncle dumped chests full of gold in the nearby river. Parents almost bought a house in London back in the 70s. My parents sold their flat in Kensington in 1985. I shudder to think what it's worth now. When Subway was just starting to become known to the general public, my parents were offered to get into the business for a very cheap price. They turned it down because they wanted to take me, was about 6 at the time, to Myrtle Beach instead that summer. Was not worth it. My great-grandfather owned a small soda company in Mick. Coca-Cola offered to incorporate it into their business. He said no because he wanted to keep it a family business. My dad, not long after my parents divorced, got 5 out of 6 numbers on the lottery. He chose number 44 and the number picked was 45. He got £50,000. But it was so close to so much more. Would have been a massive ahiduck to my mum at the time. Edit. Okay, maths people out there. Yes, I realize that getting 45 instead of 44 is no different than it being another number. My grandma is a religious lottery ticket player and always uses our birthdays as her numbers. One time, she got all the numbers right but one. She missed 27. It's because my birthday is on the 28th. Sorry, Grandma. 2 brothers owned a lot of oil land. That is, land with oil in it. One of them did not think there was any future in oil and sold his share to the other. Guess which one I'm descended from? Here is a hint: I have to work for a living. My dad was at a pub in Toronto on Halloween 1997. He was drinking when this guy came up to him dressed up like Austin Powers and started talking to him. He bought a couple rounds. My dad was joking around with him and doing impressions. The guy says he's Mike Myers. My dad says duck off. You are not Mike ducking Myers. Cue my dad arguing with this guy about who he is. And joking with him some more. The guy starts telling my dad he's hilarious and that he can help him out with a comedy career if he wants. He was really adamant about wanting to work with him. My dad just says yeah sure buddy. Like I believe that. They parted on amicable terms and my dad stumbled home. The next day he goes back to that pub for dinner with a friend and the bartender says to him, "Hey, you're that guy who was talking to Mike last night. Isn't he awesome?" Finally my dad realized that it was the real Austin ducking Powers he was drinking with. He left that bar and never returned. Ducking Christ, Dad. You could have been a ducking comedy star. All that money because he's terrible with recognition. Edit. I can't spell. My great-grandparents moved to Australia. We live in the UK. And bought a silver mine and land for a banana plantation. One year the banana plantation failed and all the money from the silver mine was put into the next year's crops. Next year the crops failed again and they were broke. They sold the land of the banana plantation to raise funds to get back to the UK where my granddad grew up. To this day the silver mine still technically belongs to us as it was never sold and the family name has stayed the same. The unfortunate thing is we have virtually no idea where in Australia it is. And Australia is pretty ducking huge. We know that it is near Brisbane. That's about it. If we magic up some paperwork we could possibly find the mine and run a really profitable business. But we can't. To be honest, this is just the story I've been told my whole life by my family. It could be complete and utter bullshit. My, now deceased, grandfather was approached by the two makers of Trivial Pursuit, before they had made the game, who he worked with. And they asked him for $1,000 as an investment. He said nope. My grandmother then proceeded to tell him that he should have invested. That didn't change his mind. Damn it, grandpa. My great-grandfather owned a small grocery store in upstate New York. He was approached to help another competing grocery store expand and he turned it down to maintain his own. That competing grocery store is now worth billions and has a cult following in most northeastern states. It starts with a W. My mom knew MRS. Portillo when they just had a couple hot dog stands. My dad could have invested in their first full restaurant. If you're not from Illinois, look up Portillo's. This is what happened to my father. Albeit before I was born. So had this happened, I probably wouldn't exist today. Instead of money, my father got the richness of me and my brother. My dad used to be a manager for a center in the 70s. He was damn good at it too. He managed a tough store in South Boston, the war zone. He has tons of crazy stories about being held at gunpoint, having a hit placed on him by someone he fired, etc. But one day he told me this and my jaw dropped. One day after work, he gets visited by a local general manager of supply stores. Nothing big. This guy comes in and says, "So I've heard about you. And I wanted to talk to you about an opportunity. I'm planning on opening a new store for office supplies. And need a good manager to start with. I can't pay you what you make now. But we'll give you a % and raises as the company grows." My dad is in his 20s. Making $60K. Which is a lot of money back then. He tells the guy he just can't walk away from what he has. And can't take that chance. That man that spoke to my father, Thomas Stemberg, co-founder of Staples. Imagine what even 2% of that could have been. Oh well. Now he's got us. TLDR. Father turns down opportunity to be first manager. With party of the company. Of what would become Staples. Welder. Colder. Shoulder. Edit. Fixed words that's wipe changed. My dad owned IBM stock, 500 shares, back in the 70s. He sold it when he doubled his money. Edited for too many zeros. My father-in-law did something similar with Microsoft. Before I was born. When my parents lived out west. They had invested in a friend's business. He was working on some sort of male contraceptive. His company was going nowhere, like 5 years later. Their investment was worth about the same as when they'd initially invested. They were moving to the other side of the country soon. And didn't want to try to keep tabs on this investment anymore. So they cashed out. A few years later, the guy's stock value grew significantly. I don't know if he sold a patent or just finally got his contraceptive into the right market or what. And it wasn't like we would have been millionaires. But they would have made $50,000 or so on their initial investment of a couple thousand. Since it wasn't something that impacted their lives that much. I didn't hear this story until my dad told me about it a couple years ago. Geez, Dad. Sounds like you shouldn't have pulled out. I remember holding out on buying some bitcoins because the price had just jumped from $2 to $4. I thought, duck that. I'll wait till it comes back down. It never did. Edit, spelling. Back in the 2006-ish, in the height of the Iraq War, my dad got a tip that there were a bunch of people, soldiers especially, converting their money to Iraqi money because once the US pulled out their economy would skyrocket and their money would be close to what the US dollar is, so he exchanged $500 US for $500,000 IQD. Today, That $500,000 IQD is worth $429 and 93 cents. Now it's in a safe just collecting dust. Every once in a while he brings it out and says, "Man, I could move to Iraq and be a half a millionaire." I guess he still has hopes that it's going to make a comeback. But for now it's just a novelty for him. TLDR, Dad invested Iraqi money when it was really low to the US dollar, hoping it would bounce back. It's even lower now. My family owned one of those Pintos that could explode in a minor accident. Sure enough, some driver hit the car from behind. But a passing truck driver had a fire extinguisher and got my sister, my mom, and me out of the car safely, even though he suffered a second-degree burn on one arm. 40 years later, my dad still wonders what he could have done with the product liability lawsuit money if it weren't for that damn truck driver. My family used to be rich in the Philippines. My grandfather had a huge gambling problem though. Ain't nobody want to live in Daly City. I guess my family could have continued to be rich. My family seems to be cursed to almost win huge sums of money. My granddad played the pools every week except for the week my gran forgot to post it for him and he would have won. Years later my cousin didn't play the lottery one week because he was on holiday and his numbers came up. Then in 2009 a friend bought me £23 worth of bitcoins, which would be worth hundreds of thousands, if not millions now. But by the time I realized how valuable they are I'd wiped my computer. The hundreds of colorful stuffed animals with heart-shaped tags sitting in tubs in my parents' attic probably have a relevant story to tell. But I doubt it's the only one here. When I was 10, McDonald's had a Scrabble game promotion. Get the letters, win the prize. So we collected and got all the letters for a trip to Disney. Except, full stop, my mom lost the letter E. We coulda gone to Disney, folks. My dad wanted to invest in Microsoft in the early 90s. And in Apple when rumors first started swirling that Jobs was coming back. Those were literally the only 2 times he was ever right, though. So nobody would trust him with the money. My mother was approached by a company claiming oil was under her grandfather's land, gorgeous farmland a couple counties away. If allowed to dig, my mom would get a good deal of money from the oil. After deliberation with her siblings, they decided to let them dig. They didn't find any oil and the land is now a mess. Not sure where you're from, but in the oil-rich territory I'm in, the oil company will usually pay you upfront to prospect for oil and then more upfront to dig and the royalties from the production. Sounds like you got hosed. My mother inherited about 150 acres from her grandfather down in Louisiana. It was about 10 miles off of the Tuscaloosa Marine Shale. We could have been rolling it. When I was a kid, one of my dad's old buddies came over to have some beers and talk to my dad about a business proposal. In the end my dad told him nah. Good luck with it though. It turns out the buddy was George Clifford, 3rd Earl of Cumberland, and he was forming the East India Company. My grandfather and Charles Schultz both were students at an art school in St. Paul. Wiki makes me think it is Art Instruction Incorporated. But I'm not positive. Before Schultz was drafted into military, apparently they were pretty decent friends. And when my grandfather showed Schultz pictures of his 2-year-old kids, my aunt and uncle, Schultz decided to draw some cartoons for them. So, pretty much every day for the next few months my grandfather would take home original Peanuts character drawings, give them to his kids, let them color all over them and then throw them away. Nowadays original Peanuts artwork can be worth anything between $750 to $450,000. We were given dozens of them. My grandfather was a cattle broker, commodities trader and businessman living in Wichita, KS in the 1950s and 60s. He was offered a significant share in Pizza Hut by its founders at the outset of the venture. Unfortunately, he did not think that pizza would ever take off as a fast food option, so he declined. As it turns out, people really like pizza. My grandfather did actually manage to get quite rich from cattle and commodities. But he could have done much better as founding investor in Pizza Hut. They were going to divide their assets equally between the grandchildren. There are 8 of us. My uncle didn't like that my mother owned 4 of the grandchildren. And he only had 1. So he let the government take it. The amount? $8 million. I missed out on a personal $1 million. My uncle is a big dick. Back around 2008 I got into Bitcoin mining. I spent $10,000 on server equipment and ran them in a spare bedroom. At the time, the price was $20. A month later, the price dropped to $15. And at that rate I was only breaking even with the costs of electricity. So I pulled the plug and lost money instead of speculating on the price going up. A few years later, the price shot up to $200. I could have been a millionaire if I had stuck with it. My grandfather was a player for the NFL back in the early 50s. Before the sport had millions of dollars in it. He would travel the county playing football and barely getting paid. Had he been born 10 years later we'd be rolling in his football money. Bit late to this, but my father was offered a good portion of land by his grandmother before she passed away. He was going to accept it, but his father decided it wasn't a good idea. Turns out the field had loads of minerals underneath it that was part of Tara mines and was worth around 100 million euros after it was all dug up. Needless to say, was slightly pissed off when I found out about this. My great grandfather had a friend who owned a McDonald's right when then we're starting up. He offered my great grandfather a partnership, but he turned it down because $100 was too much to invest for him back in the 40s. My biological father used to clean out attics for a fee and would sell the stuff. Apparently he used eBay right in the beginnings and was offered stock really cheap. Every time he logs in he mumbles about all the money he could have made. My dad once worked with his cousin importing exposting fish food. Was a small company at the time and my dad gave up his half to do something else. Company went on to be worth many millions. I heard stories a while back my family owned a significant portion of Long Island, NY. My family was wealthy around 1500s or so. Their wealth began to drain, so they moved here in the 1600s. We owned several farms, a couple mansions, a homestead, 1/3 RD of the Tudor patent. I know of 2 family cemeteries on Long Island. Sold a well-known island to Nick in the early 1900s, I think it was. Today I sit broke working 2 jobs hoping for my big break to come. No significant pieces of property remain in the family that I know of. If only there was a developer or architect in the family. This isn't just lucky break in stocks money rich. This is like significant Vanderbilt type rich and power that was missed. My family immigrated to the US during the potato famine in Scotland, hoping for a better life. Well, skip a few generations and my great-great-grandfather gets a letter from Scotland. He inherited a castle and large estate after someone died. However, no one in my family was able to afford a boat back to Scotland to claim it. I guess it went to the government? I don't know. My great uncle still has a copy of said letter. I assume it gives the details, and one day, when I can afford to go visit and see Scotland, I'm going to go get the letter from my great uncle and see if I can't track down the castle my family would have inherited. It's my dream. Edit, for grammar.